Welcome to our listening audience throughout America and the world. This is the International Leadership Conference sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation, and we are examining today the possibility of the six-party talks and the role that could occur through that kind of dialogue in terms of the Biden administration's review of possible ways to engage North Korea. The Washington Times, which is the Washington Times Foundation, is our co-sponsor along with UPF. And the Washington Times had a very good article by Guy Taylor just 2 days ago about North Korea's rejecting the Biden administration's approach. At the same time, Ambassador Joseph Detrani, one of our panelists today, did a very good piece on the possibility of China being able to leverage those dialogues again. So I think our discussion will be very special. We have three distinguished panelists, Ambassador Christopher Hill, Ambassador Joseph Detrani, and also Mr. Fred Fleitz. First, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Detrani to open this session. Ambassador Detrani is a distinguished ambassador and the envoy to the six-party talks. He worked for several years with Ambassador Hill, and just a tremendous leader in his field of intelligence, dialogue, and engagement. I've been so inspired by the work of Ambassador Detrani, both in his editorial writings and also his work as being part of the board of managers of Sandia National Laboratories. He's an adjunct professor at Missouri State University Graduate School, president of Intelligence and Security Alliance, and former U.S. representative of the Korea Energy Development Organization. He served as special advisor and director of national intelligence and director of National Counter-Proliferation Center, and would like to welcome at this time our colleague and dear friend who works for peace, Ambassador Joseph Detrani.
Thank you, Michael. That's very gracious of you. That was a very lovely introduction. Thank you. I want to thank the Universal Peace Federation for having these sessions. This is an important issue. That's why we're all here. That's why we're all so concerned. I think the topic today is very appropriate. As you mentioned, Michael, North Korea, Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong-un, recently came out and basically said, we're not overly excited about re-engaging, and further to what Kim Jong-un said a few weeks ago about basically, we could either engage or we can have confrontation. Look, I think we have to focus on what's necessary. And I think North Korea understands that. And what's necessary is for North Korea to come back to negotiations. I mean, that's a given. Because the trajectory that we're on right now, the corporate but certainly North Korea, with building more nuclear weapons and missile delivery systems, and not engaging and refusing to engage with the United States and with others, and certainly with South Korea, that's reached out with the further to President Moon Jae-in's entreaties with the Panmunjom Declaration, and talking about reconciliation between the North and South. So they have to engage. So the point now is, why not now? I mean, why? How do we get this process in motion? We can only do so much, and I think we have I know we have our envoy in South Korea, Ambassador Sung Kim, who's just very expert in this area, and who said, "I'll meet you anytime, anywhere," with a counterpart. So North Korea, basically, from all those who are so concerned, is engage with the United States. We do want a dialogue. The fact is, we don't have a dialogue. So what are the options? Obviously, the option is for North Korea to come back, and their lead representative, their special envoy, should be meeting with ours, Ambassador Sung Kim. That's point number one. But if that's not kicking in, China is so important in this equation, and we all know this. We know this from the six-party talks. We know this from our former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who reached out to Li Jiaxing, the foreign minister, in 2003 to say, get North Korea to come to the table. And that was the beginning of the six-party process that China hosted and chaired. And we saw some results. I mean, we saw a declaration, a statement, a joint statement in September 2005. And we saw some movement on dismantlement of the Yongbyon facility, but unfortunately, North Korea on the verification issue was not responsive. So that ended in early 2009. And Kim Jong-il at that time said he would never come back to the six-party process. We should keep that in mind. But this is Kim Jong-un. This is Kim Jong-un who's been in power for over 10 years. This is Kim Jong-un who has met with our former President Donald Trump. This is Kim Jong-un who's met with Vladimir Putin, who's met certainly with President Moon Jae-in, and who's had 5 summits with China. And we've had President Xi Jinping visiting Pyongyang just a year ago. And we have an allied relationship between China and North Korea, which is unique. And as China has said in the past, during the Mao era, this is lips and teeth. That's how close it is. So why not have China? Why not ask China? And hopefully China is doing this as we speak. Encourage North Korea to come back to the table, to come back and sit down with the United States and talk about complete verifiable denuclearization, with assurances that you will get the security assurances, you'll get the lifting of sanctions and a path to normal relations. But I think this is where China has to play more of a role, and hopefully they're doing that. And indeed, if it's not a question of bilateral relations, and this is the part of the subject of today's discussion, why not reconstitute the six-party process? The six-party process brought those countries together. The 2 allies, South Korea, Japan with the United States, and certainly Russia and China, both allied with North Korea with peace and friendship treaties with the DPRK. And we sat down and we worked for years to come up with that joint statement in September 2005. So that's a possibility. That's a possibility. And you know, China has their special envoy, Liu Xiaoming, who was their ambassador in North Korea. He's known to the European Union from being the ambassador in Great Britain for the last 10 years. And he was our deputy chief of mission in the United States. So he's known to all the parties, Liu Xiaoming. And so I think he has a resonance with the North Koreans, talking about that, bringing the elements together. So I guess I will end on this note. And this is going to be a very good discussion. China, do more. If you're doing it, thank you. Hopefully North Korea is listening. You have a lot of leverage with North Korea. It's not only a peace and friendship treaty that's going to be renewed next month, every 20 years, it's renewed, which is a very unique allied relationship where China would come to the defense of North Korea in times of hostility. This is a very significant piece here, but also trade and economic relations. 90% of the trade is with China, 90% of the crude oil, the petroleum product from China. So China has significant leverage with North Korea. So please use that leverage, and North Korea be responsive. If not in a bilateral sense with the United States, then let's talk about reconstituting a process that I think worked. It didn't come to true fruition with complete verifiable denuclearization, but we were on a path, and we found the stumbling block to be verification. So let's trust but verify. Let's ensure that we get that right. And if North Korea can get those deliverables that they say they want and need, we can move on that path, whether bilaterally or in a multilateral sense. So I'll end on that. I look forward to my distinguished colleagues, and I'm honored to be here with Christopher Hill and Fred Flight. So back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Ambassador Detrani. I think the thoughts you share, and also the way you've continued the relationships from the six-party talks. For example, we had a Washington Times fact finder together to the Korean National Assembly and to other parts of intelligence system there in Korea. And when we were there, one of the participants was Mr. Lee Soo-hyuk. And Joe and he knew each other from the six-party talks. They were representatives of their respective nations. And it was a beautiful thing because the friendship was there. And what do you know? A few months later, Lee Soo-hyuk became the ambassador of Korea to the United States. So I think that what you and Christopher Hill and many of the key people there in those dialogues have done is created a base of relations that's gone on since the whole 2005 era. And we really thank you for that. And Ambassador Hill, we're happy to welcome you at this time. Ambassador Christopher Robert Hill is the Charles W. Ball Distinguished Adjunct Professor of International Affairs in the Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. Ambassador Hill is a former career diplomat, I would say current career diplomat, actually, a four-time ambassador. He appointed to Macedonia in 1996 to 1999, Poland 2000 to 2004, and he served as ambassador to South Korea from 2004 to 2005. He also was appointed to be the head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks on North Korea, and did an excellent job. And I think what we've seen by our fact finders to Korea also, we've seen that Ambassador Hill is known very, very extensively throughout North Korea, South Korea, and China and Japan. Very, very respected for his candid reports that he would give during the six-party talks. After that, he served as the ambassador to one of the most difficult areas, similar to North and South Korea, was the ambassador to Iraq. So we are really, really encouraged. He's the chief advisor or formerly the chief advisor to the chancellor of Denver University and the professor of practice of diplomacy at Denver University. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Christopher Hill.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to be with you and to discuss what is not always a pleasurable subject, but one that nonetheless our country and other countries actually need to deal with. The consequence of a nuclear North Korea, that is a North Korea that has deliverable or systems to deliver nuclear weapons, is rather dire, I think, for the region and frankly for the world, and it puts into question the whole idea of non-proliferation, the whole idea of the non-proliferation treaty, and I think it is an issue that has to be kind of up there in the top tier of any administration. And I'm pleased to say the Biden administration has agreed with that. But I think we also need to understand that there are a lot of issues on the plate of the Biden administration. One of them is, of course, the issue of Iran and what can be done to reconstitute a nuclear deal with Iran, and at the same time, one that embraces some of the other issues that have bedeviled our policy toward Iran, that is their mischief especially in the Arab Middle East, in the Sunni Arab Middle East, and as well as their missile program. So that is clearly a work in progress, but one can see that in any administration, there's just a certain amount of bandwidth you can devote to problems. And I think I have the impression that Iran is a little further up there in the pecking order than North Korea. One of the problems, of course, has been that the North Koreans, while not being as categorical as Kim Jong-il's statement some 10 years ago, nonetheless have not shown an interest or willingness to engage in negotiations for the purpose of denuclearization. And I think we need to be clear that while you cannot expect them to agree to all the principles of denuclearization before getting to the talks, it is fair to expect some sign that they are prepared to deal in the talks for the purpose, on the purpose of what the talks really are, which is denuclearization. And I think there's a certain amount of reluctance to be, for example, giving North Korea sanctions relief or some other benefit simply for having returned to the talks. So I think there would be an expectation that if they're going to return, they need to return on the basis of what the talks are aiming to do. So I think there's a bit of a standoff on that issue because North Korea seems to want something to return to the talks, but at the same time, they don't seem to be willing to engage in the talks for the purpose of what the talks are, denuclearization. We've already discussed, or I should say, Ambassador Detrani, my my friend and compatriot in these talks, he's already introduced the issue of what's the format of these talks. I am a very strong believer in a multilateral format. I don't care if they call it the six parties or whatever, but what I do care about is the idea that the U.S. by itself cannot leverage the end of this problem. We need other countries to be engaged and other countries who have a substantial interest in a positive outcome. One of those is, of course, South Korea. I think the time to engage South Korea is not after we've talked to the North Koreans and then we come back to the South Koreans and tell them what we did, but rather to engage with them before we talk to the North Koreans, to make sure that, first of all, we don't have daylight between us, and secondly, to make sure that the North Koreans understand they can't go shopping for initiatives. They need to deal with essentially one initiative and a solid front of countries that have a clear and idea of where we're going to go with this. So I was very pleased to see Ambassador Sung Kim, another grizzled veteran of the six-party process. I was very pleased to see him in South Korea talking to the South Koreans about what we might do in the future. I think another extremely important issue that Ambassador Detrani raised was, of course, the question of China. Now, I have been a believer in working with China in North Korea as soon as I could spell North Korea. It's very clear that you need China involved in it. After all, the North Korean state, to a great extent, owes its very existence to China. And so China, I think it is fair to say, has leverage with North Korea. Perhaps they don't have as much leverage as some American observers suggest they do, but they certainly have more leverage than they suggest they do. So like a lot of things in life, the true answer may be somewhere in the middle. And yet we see a China that is a bit detached on this issue, or detached from us on this issue. And I think that kind of runs into the question of our overall relationship with China, which I think for some years has been, I think you could describe it as rather fraught, full of issues, full of problems, and so far not yet full of answers to all these problems. There is certainly a very broad perception in the United States that somehow China has taken advantage of international rules and not followed those rules in terms of expanding its economy, that China has been very aggressive with its neighbors. One can look at China's relations with Southeast Asia some 15 years ago, and they're pretty positive. And now look at some of the relationships there where they have fundamental disagreements over the South China Sea and China's efforts to kind of make that part of China's territory. So a lot of problems there, problems that aren't necessarily ones that the US has been directly involved in, but frankly, problems that China has made for itself in dealing with some of its neighbors, and problems that it's going to have to extract itself from. The US, I think, has correctly, upheld the value of these neighbors, partners, and in some cases allies. And I think the U.S. has been very loyal to these countries, and I think that's been a very positive factor. But obviously, we need to have a situation where we can sit down with the Chinese and try to untangle some of these problems. One of them, I think, is perhaps to some extent the elephant in the room has been the issue of the origin of the COVID virus. There are those who would like to say, okay, China's responsible and China should somehow pay dearly for this. There are others who simply want to know what happened, where it came from, and make sure it doesn't happen again. I think that when we can get through that issue of the COVID virus and its origins, and get through the issue of the extent to which China can finally become a little more transparent on that, I think that will improve the atmosphere and help kind of lay the groundwork for other areas where things can be improved. Now, clearly the US-China relationship, with all its difficulties, I don't think is just going to be resolved by addressing bilateral problems between that relationship. Like a lot of things, I think our ability to work with China could be enhanced if we can look at a third country situation and see if, or another issue out there, and see if we can kind of find a way forward in cooperating, and that can help improve some of the bilateral problems. One of these issues many people have talked about, of course, is whether we can work more closely with China on climate change. After all, China's problems with its own environment leads to problems in the US. Just look at prevailing winds over the Pacific. So clearly, we do have direct interest there, but we also have global interest with the Chinese on climate change. And I would say another issue where we have very serious interests, and China does as well, is of course the North Korean question. I think the Chinese do have more leverage than they say they do. And the question is how they can deploy that leverage and the extent to which we can cooperate with China despite the external difficulties of doing so, and whether we can find a way forward on this. I think the Chinese have traditionally been very worried about any hard push against the North Koreans. They worry about whether the regime there is as stable as it being stagnant is true, but they worry about its stability. And the Chinese don't want a situation where North Korea somehow collapses. There's a change in the political arrangements on the Korean Peninsula. This is seen by many Chinese as somehow a win for the US and a loss for China. So they worry about issues like that. They worry about what the US intentions are. Not unlike some of the Russian concerns when the whole map of Europe changed some 30 years ago. So again, I think this speaks to the need for the U.S. to work with the Chinese, sit down, see, and make sure there are not misunderstandings, and certainly not the sort of mountain of mistrust that we have with the Chinese. I do believe the Chinese can be helpful, as Ambassador Detrani suggested. They certainly know the North Koreans better than the rest of us. But I think the extent to which we can work with China, work with South Korea, frankly, work with Japan. I mean, Japan has a lot of interest too. Just look at a map and look at the range of North Korean missiles, and you can see why Japan is interested. So, you know, the six-party talks was not some kind of arbitrary number arrived at. It reflected countries that I think have a direct interest, in Russia's case, actually a direct border with North Korea. So whether people call it the six-party talks or call it something else, I think these countries all need to be involved, and I think it behooves the U.S. to see if we can work with these countries, however, in whatever format we choose, or we all choose, and see if we can kind of make it clear to the North Koreans that their policies, their efforts to develop nuclear weapons, whether they think they have a right to, whether they think the US has a hostile policy that requires their stockpiling of nuclear weapons, a proposition that I absolutely reject. I think they need to understand that it's not just the US, it's not just South Korea, it's a lot of countries that are worried about this situation. North Korea's endemic problems are not going to be solved by nuclear weapons, nor will its so-called regime survival be assured through nuclear weapons. If North Korea has instability, it will be more along the lines of agriculture failures, which we seem to be seeing right now, industrial failures, which they've had for decades, and essentially a population that whose needs are not being met by the North Korean government. The North Korean government, Kim Jong-un, seems to understand that their problems are not being met by, that the government is not solving the people's problems. But the notion that somehow nuclear weapons are the solution just flies in the face of elementary logic. And the North Koreans really need to kind of return to, or get to some place where they can start being a normal country with normal interactions with the world. And I think the way to do that is to be serious about doing away with their nuclear weapons. And the way to be serious about that is to come to the talks in the spirit of getting rid of nuclear weapons, rather than just for the purpose of coming to the talks. So look forward to the discussion today, but those are some opening thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It was just excellent to receive that insight. And also, you're always very optimistic about engagement and helping people to see there's always possibilities, always possibilities. And you served in some of the most difficult areas of the world. And we thank you so much and looking forward to the discussion. Our next panelist is Mr. Fred Fleitz. He's the president and CEO of the highly respected Center for Security Policy. He was also Deputy Assistant to President Donald Trump and Chief of Staff to National Security Advisor John Bolton, and has a 25-year career history with the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, also with the State Department and House of Representatives Intelligence Committee. He authored a great book that I enjoyed very much, The Coming North Korean Nuclear Nightmare. It's on Amazon. You can get it. It's well worth your investment there. He's featured many, many times in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, Jerusalem Post, and on all major media. Welcome, Mr. Fred Fleitz.
Michael, thank you. It's great to be here today and with my friend, Ambassador Jutrani and Ambassador Hill. We met once in the House Intelligence Committee when you sat through a rather difficult grilling by the members, but that's just the way these things go. We're talking about the six-party talks, resuming them right now because the Biden administration would like to deal with threats from rogue states multilaterally and with coalitions. And we see that occurring right now with Iran, with these indirect talks in Vienna to get the United States back into the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And Biden officials have said they would like to deal with North Korea multilaterally also. I haven't heard them say they want to resume the six-party talks, but my guess is that that is their objection. The problem we know with almost 30 years of negotiations with the North Koreans is that all bilateral and multilateral attempts at diplomacy have failed in both Republican and Democratic administrations. Some have been abysmal failures. And so to try to find a path forward is difficult. I think we should try to learn from our mistakes, but I'm afraid we are usually on a track to make those mistakes again. The agreed framework, which resulted in talks under the Clinton administration, resulted in an agreement that kicked major issues down the road, such as the disposition of North Korea's spent fuel rods. It did not have adequate verification. And as Colin Powell testified in 2003, North Korea began cheating on this agreement while the ink was still drying to develop a secret enrichment program. The multilateral six-party talks began in 2003 after the failure, the collapse of the agreed framework, because tensions obviously had surged between the United States and North Korea. And I take a different view on these than my friend Joe Dutrani. I think they were an utter and abysmal disaster. And the reason I say that is because North Korea clearly used the time of these talks to build nuclear weapons, to develop its nuclear arsenal. While the talks were underway in 2006, North Korea tested its first nuclear device. In May of 2009, the nuclear talks, the six-party talks, were officially canceled because North Korea tested another nuclear device. So whatever minor gains we had in shutting down North Korea's nuclear infrastructure, I think were greatly offset by how the North manipulated these talks and used the time to build up its nuclear arsenal. Now, Ambassador Hill made a very tough effort in the late Bush administration, to a bilateral effort to try to get an agreement. But this included some huge concessions, such as agreeing to a bogus declaration of North Korea's nuclear program, taking North Korea off the state-sponsored terror list, and agreeing to a verification plan that would sort of be agreed to later in a future round of nuclear talks. It was a great effort. But unfortunately, weeks after it was agreed to in the fall of 2008, North Korea reneged on all these agreements and announced in early 2009 that it had weaponized 68 pounds of plutonium, enough for 4 or 5 nuclear weapons. This appeared to be a ploy to influence negotiations with the incoming Obama administration, but it was just another example of the North Koreans negotiating in bad faith, turning down very generous concessions by the West, by the United States, to try to get an agreement, and then frankly, stabbing the other side in the back. The Obama administration wisely did not resume the six-party talks and focused on Iran in its time in office. But we know that North Korea's missile and nuclear program surged enormously during the Obama years. And this included 76 missile launches and tests of 4 nuclear devices of increasing sophistication and yield. Now, President Trump took a different approach, personal diplomacy, bilateral diplomacy with leader Kim. But this followed a year of threats and a situation that led to, in early 2018, what many thought would result in war with North Korea. You may remember President Trump saying from the floor of the UN General Assembly that the US would utterly destroy North Korea if it threatened America's allies in the region. This had an effect and got the North to the negotiating table. It enabled the president to have the bilateral talks with Kim Jong-un in June of 2018. We know these talks were not completely successful. We did not get a nuclear deal out of North Korea. We did not get an agreement to get North Korea to give up and dismantle its missile program. But I would say that Trump's approach was the most successful, and that might just be in the context of what he inherited in 2017 and what happened in September 2018 when North Korea tested what may have been a hydrogen bomb, certainly a very powerful nuclear device that may have had a yield of 250 kilotons. This was a huge threat to regional security, and by strengthening compliance with sanctions in 2017 and with some very tough threats, I think Trump moved the needle a little bit. The problem is at the lower levels, we saw what we've seen for almost 3 decades. The North Korea did not show any serious interest, no sincere interest in negotiating. They liked the personal diplomacy between Kim and Trump, but they weren't prepared to make significant concessions. Trump lowered tensions. There hasn't been a nuclear test since September 2017. There have not been any long-range missile tests, although short-range missile tests resumed in mid-2019, partially because of North Korea's frustration that it could not get concessions out of the US. I give the Trump administration a lot of credit for not offering concessions before North Korea moved first. But we are where we are. I think in a second Trump term, we would have had more opportunities to see if we could get North Korea to negotiate. But now we're looking at the prospect of the 6-party talks restarting, and I'm very concerned about that. I think Trump was wise to do this multilaterally and not through the 6-party talks because we kept China out. I don't think it's a good thing to let China run or control or influence negotiations with North Korea. We should use whatever leverage they have, but having them at the table, allowing them to host talks, allows them to control the process. And that gives North Korea opportunities to not agree to a tough agreement. I think the bilateral approach with a strong US president, a strong US was the best way to go. If we're going to go down the 6-party talk approach, China should not chair the talks. It should be some other state, maybe Japan. And I think that we have to have a very tough approach by the United States on what the consequences will be if North Korea does not negotiate sincerely and in earnest. We don't see North Korea interested in that right now. I think it's trying to extract concessions from the Biden administration in the short term. But I think China's going to put a lot of pressure on the other parties, other former 6-party talks participants, so it can begin to dominate and control this process again. And I suspect that the North will agree to that. But for now, I think the North is trying to get bilateral talks with the US and to extract concessions. I think the threatening language is what the North usually does to a new administration. I hope it does not follow up with missile and nuclear tests. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some long-range missile tests to put more pressure on the Biden administration. They have to be tough. They have to be strong. If we have a strong US policy, bilaterally would be best, but if we have to go to 6-party talks, it has to be accompanied by a very principled and strong US approach that there will be consequences if North Korea does not negotiate sincerely. So those are my 2 cents on this.
Thank you, Fred. That's excellent. And very good to have all opinions really brought to the table. This is a very important discussion because the Biden administration is considering all options right now. So Ambassador Hill, we have some questions coming in from the audience, and I'd like to ask our tech team to put us all on the screen so we can just have an open dialogue. And all the panelists, please feel free to go ahead and intervene or give your points anytime. But I'll start with asking Ambassador Hill, can you respond to some of Fred's concerns of China having too much control and influence. One thing I learned from our Washington Times fact finders was that without China's support in some way or another, we're not going to get North Korea to become even interested in reunification in a democratic form. So, Ambassador Hill, one time you made it very clear that China has to see that they're not going to have an enemy state of a unified Korea with American troops on their border. China has to see the vision of a positive development in the Northeast Asia area that will be mutually beneficial. So, Ambassador Hill, what are your thoughts about China in relation to Fred's important remarks?
First of all, I think we should be having serious discussions with China, not only about today's problem with North Korea, but tomorrow's solution. I think it's very important in the context of a discussion like that to make clear to the Chinese that we do not want a Korean peninsula that's hostile to China, but how the Korean peninsula behaves is up to the people on the Korean peninsula. And it's not for the US and China to negotiate some Finlandization of the Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea is responsible for its own foreign policy. And if it chooses to have an alliance with the US, and if the US chooses to have an alliance with South Korea, this is something the Chinese are going to have to live with and not think that they can somehow turn South Korea into some kind of, even if it's not just South Korea, but rather embraces the whole peninsula in the future. But it cannot be because of China's girth, if you will, it cannot be turned into some kind of tributary state. So I think there needs to be an understanding, a clear understanding about that. Look, we have a lot of problems with China, and there's a, you know, we're going to have a lot of things to get through with China. But I do think we have to have a serious discussion with them about the fact that we're not going to accept a nuclear North Korea. And waiting for a better day is not necessarily going to help us. Now, I would disagree with Fred a bit on the issue of how much progress has been made since the Singapore summit. I think to some extent the North Koreans got a lot out of that. They got a lot of international recognition. I mean, countries were lined up to see the North Koreans. And I think it took a lot of effort by other people to try to tamp those expectations down and to maintain the sanctions, because I think the sanctions are very important as leverage on North Korea. And the feeling after Singapore was that somehow the sanctions were going to kind of come apart, and a lot of countries were less willing to observe them. If the U.S. is talking directly to the North Koreans, essentially changing decades of a policy of diplomatic isolation, I think it was a full-time job just to keep those sanctions in place. They are more or less in place. I think they ought to continue to be in place until North Korea shows a seriousness of purpose on the nuclear on their nuclear ambitions. One other point I'd like to make is, you know, negotiation. I mean, everyone has a different idea of how to do it. I mean, you see how two people might deal with negotiating to buy a car, and they may have a completely different approach. Often in diplomatic relations, you try to go one small step, and then the other guy makes a reluctant small step, and then you make sure that it's all verifiable, and then you kind of go to the second small step. So kind of step by step. I mean, I think the chances of North Korea collectively hitting the side of their head with the palm of their hand and saying, now we understand you're really good guys and we're going to go along with complete denuclearization today, I just don't think that's going to happen. To be sure, when they gave us a statement, this is back in 2007, when they gave us a statement of a declaration of their nuclear arsenal, it was not complete. There was no explanation or any acknowledgement that they clearly had a highly enriched uranium program, not unlike most countries that have gone nuclear. They clearly had that second track to nuclear weapons. So one thought was, okay, let's go ahead and verify the plutonium, get some people on the ground. And by the way, I have always felt whether it's an intel or business or intel or diplomacy, you need people on the ground. We don't have them on the ground right now. And I would have liked to see more effort to get people back on the ground. So the idea is you try to verify what you got, and then you take it to a next step. And unfortunately, with the North Koreans, they're pretty much set on the idea of nuclear weapons, and we need to dissuade them. And I think sanctions is part of it, but maybe also a little more aggressiveness on the sort of gray area, not dropping bombs on them, because I'm not sure our partners would hang in for that. But making at times their nuclear program more difficult for them than it is today.
Joe, your response? Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, no, let me say thank you, Fred, for your comments. And Chris, I agree with a lot of what you said. Look, the fact is, we've negotiated, as Fred indicated, for almost 30 years, 27 years of negotiations. It's true, we do obviously haven't been successful, but we've had moments where there was momentum. With whether it was the plutonium program, whether it was with the agreed framework, the six-party talks, or certainly with President Donald Trump in the Singapore joint statement in June of 2018. But the fact is, we've heard from Kim Jong-il, and we've heard now from Kim Jong-un that they are prepared for complete denuclearization. And in the six-party talks, we talked about abandoning all nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities. That's clear. But they had a path to highly enriched uranium, and I totally agree. That was, they want that assurance. And what North Korea wants, and they still want, is to be accepted as a nuclear weapon state. But I submit from many years of negotiating with the North Koreans, either formally or informally, they're also interested in a normal relationship with the United States. They don't want to be just tethered to China. They want that international legitimacy. And I think we saw that with President Donald Trump. As Fred correctly indicated, this was the president, and Chris Hill noted, he got the attention that Kim Jong-un was, I think, seeking. He had summits with the People's Republic of China, with Russia, certainly with South Korea. His visit to Singapore was displayed prominently even in North Korea, to show the North Korean people that there are people living outside of North Korea who are living pretty well. He showed that. So here's a young man, he's been in power for over 10 years now, but a relatively young man now, 37, who said, I want international legitimacy and I want a normal relationship with the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, it was not only Kim Jong-il and now Kim Jong-un, but it was also Kim Il-sung to Billy Graham in 1994 with Jimmy Carter, where he talked about a normal relationship with the United States. That's not too hard to understand. That's not too hard to understand. And we've seen that with the Nixon visit to China in '72, how you have to break through something. And sometimes you go against the current and you do something like that. And there are reasons why North Korea wants that. So let's focus on that. They want a normal relationship with the United States, but they want the nuclear weapons. They want it like Pakistan. And they've told us that so often. Treat us the way you treat Pakistan. And what we're saying is you with nuclear weapons will lend itself to a nuclear arms race in the region, proliferation issues with the possibility of nuclear weapons or fissile material going to terrorists or rogue states for dirty bombs. This is not going to happen. So what we have to be is resolute in our pursuit, understanding North Korea wants a normal relationship with the United States. And the options we have are finite, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, we can continue with the sanctions, and we should. There should be consequences when North Korea is violating UN Security Council resolutions. We should continue implementing those sanctions. We should continue to ensure that we have a good deterrence capability and our commitments to our allies and partners are there. We should have the missile defense capabilities that are there. But if we continue on this path and North Korea keeps building nuclear weapons and launching missiles, the possibility of stumbling into accidental war is always there. What are the other options? Well, the other option is sitting at the table and seeing if we can get some movement on denuclearization, getting them to stop producing more nuclear weapons and missile delivery systems, and moving towards that and giving them what they want, which are the security assurances and a path to normal relations, but also the eventual lifting of sanctions, because there are humanitarian issues here, and encouraging South Korea, as the Biden administration is doing, with inter-Korean relations for economic and humanitarian purposes. So we have that option there of negotiating on one side or continuing on the path of, if North Korea persists and doesn't come back to the talks on that. So I think it's very clear. But also what North Korea is hoping, and let's keep this in the back of our mind, that they wear us out. That after 27 years, going on 30 years, that we eventually say, enough. Maybe let's just accept them as we accepted Pakistan. Let's get into arms control negotiations and so forth. That would be, if I was sitting in Pyongyang, that would be my advice to the chairman: persist, because the US may not, and their allies may not be resolute enough to persist. But we can't give in on that. And I think that's where China is in sync with the United States. China does not want a nuclear North Korea. My goodness, a loose nuke on North Korea, or the possibility of instability, or the possibility of migration coming into China. This is not what Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party wants at this time, when they're talking about economic development issues and other issues with the United States. They want to see denuclearization. And that means abandoning nuclear weapons and weapons facilities. And I'll end on this point. Many critics say, we don't know what denuclearization means. I'm sorry. We've been negotiating with North Korea. We know what it means, and they know what it means: abandoning all nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities. And then talking about not only the plutonium path, but the highly enriched uranium path, which was the problem in Hanoi in those negotiations with President Donald Trump. So they know it. And we could say that in our first meeting. Our special envoy, Sung Kim, could say that to his counterpart in North Korea. You do understand what we're talking about. And when North Korea says, that's not our understanding, fine. Then we need to maybe look at that other option of continuing with the sanctions, continuing with the deterrence, and so forth, knowing that that's going to be an area where we have to be very careful, because we don't want accidental war on the Korean Peninsula. We're talking about reunification, ladies and gentlemen. We're not talking about conflict. We're not seeing another Korean war on the Korean Peninsula, and we're talking about nuclear weapons in this equation. So I think the options are clear. They're very finite, but they're very clear. And I think this is where China can help, because I think they have a mutual interest in denuclearization, abandoning nuclear weapons and weapons facilities. Look, they wouldn't name Ambassador Liu Xiaoming, a man with a very distinguished diplomatic career, who knows North Korea, knows the United States, knows the European Union so well, if China wasn't serious about getting North Korea back into line. And further to Ambassador Hill's comments, he's absolutely right. These are issues where we can work with China. China can show an overture to the US and to the world that they're willing to work on not only climate, trade issues, but also issues of national security like North Korea and the nuclear issue. So I think there's an opportunity here, whether it's the six-party talks, whether it's something else. If we can't get bilateral going, then let's go with the multilateral. And I'll definitely end on this. The Korea Energy Development Organization was not only the United States and South Korea and Japan, it was the European Union that was very active in that. And Australia was very active in that. But there are a lot of players who are interested in contributing to this, because they know North Korea with nuclear weapons and the proliferation issues related to that are significant and will affect not only the region, but the world. So this is something I think we have a common interest in. And why not look at all the options necessary to move on a peaceful path, obviating the possibility of accidental war on the Korean Peninsula.
So next question from our audience. Tom McDivitt, chairman of the Washington Times, asks, what role can the international community play, including the Quad of India, Australia, and US and Japan in support of these 6 key nations having some kind of collaboration. Anybody want to respond to that? Christopher or Fred?
Well, the Quad is a work in progress. It's an effort to bring India really into the Asia Pacific space as opposed to South Asia. I think it's a good idea. I think India is a very large player and needs to be more involved in some of these issues. And I'm very pleased at the increase over the past decade or so in U.S. interest in India. On the nuclear question, I'm not sure India is a textbook case or a particularly inspiring case for having North Korea give up their nuclear weapons. I always remember one of my North Korean interlocutors saying, "Why can India have it and we can't?" And I said, "We really don't have time to explain the differences between you and India." And that was as polite a formulation as I could come up with. So I'm not sure how much India can help on that, but certainly to the extent that we can have more allies in the process and more in the sort of overall process, and make North Korea understand that no, their future is not going to be assured by a nuclear arsenal. Their future will be assured by integration with other countries in the region and countries that they could probably have good relations with, even if the relationship with the U.S. I think will always be somewhat constrained. But they could have some better relations elsewhere, which, by the way, they have tried to pursue, especially after the U.S. kind of broke the diplomatic isolation. So I hope we can do some more in this concept of the Quad, but I'm not sure it can specifically address the issue of nuclear negotiations.
Well, Fred, Secretary Pompeo emphasized the Quad right at the end of his term. And also, we see that many key experts on China would say that President Trump did a good job of actually causing China to enter a much more balanced relationship with the US. But however, there's no way to avoid China's support for bringing North and South Korea together. How do you see bringing China in the proper relationship with the United States in support of denuclearization of North Korea? We've had our Chinese representatives at our conferences and Russian representatives confirm neither Russia or China do not want a nuclear North Korea with ICBMs with deliverable warheads.
Well, I don't like the idea of making a bad idea worse. That is, expanding the six-party talks to include more states. I think the larger it gets, the less efficient it's going to be. But I do like the idea of including India and Australia in some type of a process with North Korea, because they will stand up to China. I think they will try to limit China's influence and try to push for a tougher agreement with North Korea if one could be reached. I think the Quad initiative is important to also counter Chinese influence in the region. I think that that's a positive thing. I wanted to respond briefly to some of the comments by my colleagues on the panel. I think that what Trump did with the bilateral diplomacy was bold. It was heavily criticized, but I think it led the North Koreans, it led Kim Jong-un to realize that coexistence is possible, that there could be a better future by working with the US. I regret it didn't go much beyond the summit level, but I think those meetings, those bilateral meetings between our president and their leader was very powerful. And I'm hoping it will lead to some type of evolving movement in North Korea's thinking that it doesn't have to test ICBMs. It won't test another H-bomb type weapon, that it isn't necessary, that the US is not going to invade. I mean, that's my hope. I wish that Trump had achieved more. I think in the short term, though, I don't think much is going to happen under Biden. I think the North Koreans really respect strength. And I don't think Biden is going to have a strong policy in foreign policy in general. And in North Korea, his administration seems confused, and I think we will have low-level talks that will go nowhere. I hope we don't drift into six-party talks. We may see a caretaker administration, and maybe a stronger Republican president will take office in 2025 who will resume a serious bilateral effort in getting a denuclearization agreement with North Korea.
Comments, Joe or Chris?
Well, let me just say this. I agree with Fred, his comments about President Donald Trump and the Singapore meetings, and then in Hanoi. Unfortunately, Hanoi didn't go anywhere. But President Donald Trump went from fire and fury to actually sitting down with Kim Jong-un. And I thought that was major. And I think it gave Kim Jong-un a sense of respect. Let me use that word. And they seek that. So I give a lot of credit to President Donald Trump for doing that, from going from fire and fury to actually sitting down and talking about complete verifiable denuclearization. It didn't go beyond that. But I also give credit to President Biden, understanding where he is on this issue here. I think Christopher Hill mentioned we have the JCPOA. Iran is high on the list. There are a lot of other issues high on the list. So North Korea has got to understand that, there's only so much bandwidth. There's so much we could do. And by escalating, by doing something provocative, you don't want to be doing that to get someone's attention. It could be counterproductive at this time. So hopefully North Korea will refrain from another nuclear test, will refrain from a long-range ballistic missile launch, and would be responsive to some overtures about at least meeting with our special envoy, Ambassador Sung Kim, or in addition to that, the multilateral approach of where you have Ambassador Liu Xiaoming sitting in Pyongyang and saying, look, maybe we need to get something going here, or maybe Xi Jinping can weigh in on that, whether it's bilateral with the US or bringing some of the allies and partners together, whether it's the six-party participants, because they were all involved in that issue. I mean, you had two allies of North Korea, China and Russia, with North Korea. You had the US and Japan and the Republic of Korea together. So, I mean, there was an interesting mix, a very important one. So I think, look, I think we have to be positive at a time like this, and not sort of be too patient. We should be resolute, and North Korea needs to know what our objectives are and our willingness to reach out. But indeed, if there's provocative acts from North Korea, there needs to be consequences. There's no question about that. But we should be open, and we should open that element of creativity and flexibility that the Biden administration is talking about. So I think we're at a moment now, and personally, I'm for multilateral. I personally am, because it's not just a U.S. issue, and we know this. Now, I think the Biden administration correctly has told South Korea, pursue inter-Korean relations, economic and humanitarian relations. I think that's important to get that going, and hopefully North Korea will respond to that. But I think we can go even farther and include some other countries, and I think China can be so instrumental in getting so much of this in play.
Ambassador Hill?
Yeah, if I could just add, look, I do believe that policy should be based on the facts of the situation. The fact is North Korea is developing nuclear weapons. The policy needs to respond to that, how to dissuade them from that. But I think I do need to mention the possibility of what the real North Korean motive is. Now, we've talked about their desire for survival, and somehow nuclear weapons is going to ensure their survival. I would argue it's kind of disconnected from survival. And I would also argue that their motive is, I'm sorry to suggest, is kind of more nefarious than we've kind of talked about, the idea of survival. I mean, who doesn't have a right to survival? I think the real motive is to create a circumstance where the North Koreans, where the US has to look at the question of whether we want to stay in South Korea given that there's a real and present nuclear threat, even tactical nuclear weapons, another kind of worrisome development. And what I don't want to see is North Korea create a situation for a future president to say, you know, South Korea could probably handle itself. Do we really need to be there as a tethered goat? That is, if they attack South Korea, we're into a war and into a war with a country with nuclear weapons. And so, again, I don't like to talk about motive attribution, but could it be that the North Koreans are really, their real motive for these weapons is to decouple the US from the Korean Peninsula? And I was very worried when I listened to the press conference after Singapore, where we seemed to be willing to do more of these suspensions of joint exercises with the South Koreans. You know, troops, you have alliances not so that your militaries can play volleyball together. You have alliances so your militaries can come together and fight against a common enemy. And I was a little worried to see a willingness to kind of suspend exercises and a comment that in the long run, we'd like to withdraw our troops. So I think we need to understand that North Korea is putting a lot of their GDP, such as it is, in nuclear weapons. And maybe it's not just about survival. Maybe it's about decoupling the US from the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, but didn't the Clinton administration suspend military exercises too during the agreed framework talks?
I'm not here to talk about one administration versus the other.
Because you don't want to face the fact that they did. They did. So that's a fake argument.
I wasn't involved with that. I know that there was a big effort to give them civil nuclear capabilities, that somehow they'd move from military to civil nuclear. I'm just concerned about the overall, and I said going forward, not going backwards, but going forward to the question of, will our country be willing to continue this very close alliance in the face of a country that has developed or is developing nuclear weapons, both tactically and intercontinentally? That, to me, is what the North Koreans probably are up to. And that, to me, is what we need to think about more.
So let me comment on that, Chris. I don't disagree with you. I think North Korea has always been interested in that element of decoupling, getting the U.S. and putting a wedge between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. I don't disagree with that at all. But I think North Korea has to understand, and I think our allies in South Korea know this, that the U.S. is committed to our relationship with the Republic of Korea. That this is an allied relationship, it's a bedrock relationship, and we're there for them. So I think this is the value of obviously a dialogue with North Korea. So they understand there are certain tenets here that are, that are unmovable. And that is part of that is our relationship with the Republic of Korea, and I would say with Japan, our allies in the region, and we're there for them. But we want to open that spigot up, and we want to talk about complete verifiable denuclearization, which eventually will help lead into whether it's a federation, but eventually lead into reunification, because that's what we're here to talk about. The reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And then this fiction of, at the 38th parallel and two Koreas, and move towards that reunification, and denuclearization will lend itself. Certainly in North Korea with nuclear weapons. And if we should ever get into arms control talks and accepting them, this is anathema to reunification. This is moving in the other direction. Not only is it a non-proliferation nightmare with the possibility of a nuclear arms race and nuclear proliferation in the region, and what that means, which is significant, but it also is just moving farther and farther away from the possibility of ever seeking a reunification, because we will be there for South Korea. But a North Korea with nuclear weapons will not lend itself to even even a remote possibility of eventual reunification.
Very good. Another question came in about China. China was seen for many years to be a country we wanted to engage, help them develop economically, and they would grow out of communism. And now the ideology is as strong as ever with Xi Jinping, and they are as dangerous or more dangerous than ever. And it appears, the question is, doesn't China see America as their main enemy in the world? And doesn't China want, without war, to see America leave the Korean Peninsula? Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, well, let me just say, look, China does see the U.S. as the major adversary. I think Xi Jinping has put it out there very clearly with China, made in China 2025, where China is going. China will be the dominant player. There's no question about Xi Jinping and what his intentions are and what his vision is for China, and stoking that element of nationalism, which lends itself to nativism, talking about the 100 years of humiliation and so forth. So he is playing on that. There's no question about that. There are issues here, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's the Xinjiang, whether it's Hong Kong. There are a lot of issues here that need to be resolved. And the U.S. has made it very clear, this administration and the Trump administration, clear that these issues have to be discussed. And we've called what's going on in Xinjiang genocide. So we've been very, very outspoken on that. And we see this certainly with the Biden administration also very, very clearly on that. So Xi Jinping has made it clear, yes, the major near peer competitors, and that's where it's going. But he has also said, and certainly Wang Yi, who's the foreign minister, state counselor, has made it clear, and others, that there are elements of cooperation. And we see this with John Kerry's visit to China, talking about climate change. We're talking about other things with our trade representative meeting with their trade representative, talking about working with the imbalance in trade and the market access issues there. And as Christopher Hill correctly pointed out, another issue is national security. North Korea, why can't we cooperate on that? So if we can move that pendulum to just not competition as adversaries and so forth, but to areas of mutual interest and concern, where we can work together to address issues like North Korea, like climate change, like the trade imbalance, et cetera, and then resolve some of those elements of tension, real tension. And then that speaks to human rights issues, that speaks to the South China Sea and the militarization of the islands in the region. So yeah, there are a lot of issues there, but that's why we have diplomacy. And I give Biden administration a lot of credit for emphasizing diplomacy. And Christopher Hill is sitting with us, and he spent his career doing this. This is why we have diplomats. This is why we have diplomats on both sides, to work through the issues and so forth, and then bring it up to the leadership elements and that. So yes, I agree with the questioner, the premise of the question asked, but I submit, however, that there are so many issues where we have mutual interest, where we can cooperate and move forward on. And even as near competitors, does that mean we cannot coexist? Does that mean peaceful coexistence is impossible? What are we talking about, ladies and gentlemen? Let's work through the issues there and be frank and candid as we are with China and as they are with us. And look, there's 1.4 billion people, over 330 million people in the United States, and we have significant allies and what have you. A lot of these issues will sort itself out because of our values and because of some of the activities on the part of China and what they're doing with the BRI and other initiatives. So I think we just have to be forward leaning and not fall into this, they're an enemy, we're an enemy, and let's just get ready and we're just going to go and duke it out. Let's compete fairly, and we will be extremely competitive, and we will predominate, whether it's new technology, whatever it is, and so forth. But that's fair. But those elements of cooperation, let's address them, because we owe it to the people of North Korea, the people on the Korean Peninsula, but also the people in the United States and the people in China, that we work through these issues and we don't stumble into accidental war.
Thank you. Ambassador Hill, next question is on what does Kim Jong-un want besides becoming a nuclear state and accepted as that? What other things did he want by coming to meet President Trump? What other things does he want that could, like economic development or whatever, that could actually make him consider really seriously letting go of the nuclear program?
Well, given some of his,
China also to support that.
I mean, given some of his recent comments, he seems to be very concerned about the economy. And so I can believe that that is on his list of things he needs to get done. That said, he has seemed always to prefer to further develop the nuclear program than to develop the economy. So I don't think it's trumped the nuclear program. He's also made ambiguous comments about my earlier point, whether he wants us on the Korean Peninsula or not. I just think he needs to understand that we're going to stay in South Korea, as long as South Korea and we want to stay. That we're not staying in South Korea just because of ourselves. We're staying in South Korea because we have a mutual defense agreement with the South Koreans. We also have a mutual defense agreement with Japan. And if he thinks that he can decouple us from the region, he ought to think again. And I think we need to make that clear to him from time to time, just so he doesn't think otherwise. So it's difficult because, by the way, I'm not sure he really knows what he wants, and that's one of the most difficult aspects of the whole problem.
And what do you see China, what could really allow China to support the reunification of Korea?
Well, I think China,
North Korea.
Yeah, I think China needs to stay out of the way if that's the process that's underway. I mean, I would be more worried about China kind of concluding that this is not a good idea and therefore interfering with it. Now, the Chinese have always said that's up to the Koreans, and that's the right policy to have, and I would hope to see them implement that policy if we get to a point where Korea wants to, where the Korean people want to come together, in my view, under a successor state as the Republic of Korea.
Fred, can you help us on this area, the Hanoi summit? What went wrong? Why did it break down? North Korea wasn't doing anything to respond to the engagement and the Singapore agreements. Tell us about that. What happened?
Well, there was no progress after Singapore, and there was increasing rhetoric by the North against American diplomats, including, I think, a comment about Mike Pompeo being a mafia member as a diplomat. So eventually, after the election, there was an agreement to have this summit in Vietnam. And it seems that there was a real difference in expectations. I think the North thought we were prepared to agree to a step-by-step solution to move forward. President Trump had not agreed to that. John Bolton and Pompeo had not agreed to that. Unfortunately, at lower levels of the US government, they had communicated, at least through the media and probably directly to North Korea, that the US was going to be more cooperative than the president was prepared to be. And I think the North was pretty certain they were going to get some kind of an agreement. They did not expect President Trump to walk out. But he basically said to Kim at the meeting that until you agree to denuclearize, we're not going to lift sanctions. And with that absolute position, the talks broke down, and eventually the North started testing short-range missiles again. I think they were surprised because we have a history over 27, 28 years of Republican, Democratic administrations so desperate for a deal, we will throw some concessions unilaterally at the North, hoping that they will later come through. President Trump refused to do that.
Joe, any thoughts on that Hanoi summit? I think that we made a lot of progress up until that point, but then it really got stopped right there. And this has been the history with U.S.-North Korean relations. Very hard to get them to do what they said they would do.
But a fast comment on that, Michael. I would have hoped that Kim Jong-un would have responded to President Donald Trump. When President Trump put on the table, we want all of the facilities to include highly enriched uranium, but also your missiles and chemical and biological. And that would be a time to sort of say, okay, look, I'm giving you this, I'm proposing this. Let's talk about these things here. That was, to me, the beginning of a negotiation, beginning of doing the heavy lifting that negotiations are all about, rather than both sides walking away from the table. Because as we see, it's easy to walk away from the table. It's very hard to get people to the table. And I would have hoped at that point we would have stayed at the table. And by staying at the table, Kim Jong-un would have had to respond. And he didn't have a response. So understandably, you can see where President Donald Trump said, well, there's no response. Let's just go home. Hopefully, in hindsight, if Kim's advisors, who his foreign minister and others could have been saying, stay at the table, put this in play, and we'll work through some of the issues here, but keep the dialogue going. But when you cut off dialogue like that after all that work, you can see how it is to reconstitute it.
Chris?
You know, having been in these negotiations, and then you have people 10,000 miles away criticizing what you're doing, I'm kind of reluctant to criticize those who were at the table in Hanoi. I guess I would have liked to know, even though I think at the end I would have done exactly what the American negotiators did, including the president. I would have liked to know what exactly the North Koreans were proposing. I would have liked to take a huge diagram of the Yongbyon facility with its 100 buildings or whatever it is, and I would have liked to go through building by building and have them tell us how they were going to dismantle that, just for the value of getting a sense of, were they willing to be specific about this? Were they still hiding these national security secrets in these various buildings? I would have liked to know whether the HEU facility that Sig Hecker famously saw at Yongbyon, is that included? Where is that? And, you know, have them, I would have taken advantage of, I would have said, okay, let's spend the next day explaining what it is you're proposing. I can't be critical of people there. I don't want to say we should have taken some deal that may not have been much of a deal. But I would have liked to know more about what they exactly had in mind. There's certainly a good argument that, hey, most of this Yongbyon stuff is rather old, and the real center of gravity of their program is now elsewhere in HEU. I get that. But I still would have liked to know more about this as an indication of how serious they are in talking to us with a level of transparency, a word that is quite foreign to them.
It's pretty widely reported that there is starvation going on again in North Korea. The economy's in the worst shape for quite a long time. The pandemic is now, it's becoming clear that they are being ravaged by COVID. They closed their borders to China, which also hurt their development or economic stability. So what should NGOs do? What should America do in that situation? Should America step in right now? Why doesn't China step in more? You would think that they would make an urgent effort to try to alleviate this suffering. Chris, Fred, Joe?
I mean, I'll just take a whack at that. My own view is starving kids are not going to change a regime, and that as a fundamental humanitarian issue, we need to help, even though they have the North Koreans, they can't blame the weather. They have to blame themselves for this situation. You know, the other thing is, we absolutely, if we're going to give humanitarian assistance, or if someone's going to give it, whether it's an international organization or whatever, you need people to monitor it. And in the past, I remember, frankly, it was kind of classic North Korea. They had a reverse language provision. That is, you could only monitor it if you did not speak Korean. You know, not sure that's going to work for us either. And if they're really as starving as they say there are, you know, they don't dictate the terms of how knowledgeable the monitors are. But, you know, I wouldn't just ignore this. And, you know, just as a fundamental human value, I mean, to have kids starve, albeit because of the behavior of their government rather than the behavior of the weather, I just wouldn't let them starve. But I would insist on some serious monitoring of what is exactly going on. And by the way, getting people on the ground and knowing what's going on is a good thing. And I think whenever that's on the table, we should look at it very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add to that, and then Fred, please. But I agree with Chris. But as you said correctly, Michael, the food situation is very dire in North Korea. And Kim Jong-un has said it himself. It's tense, the situation there. They closed the border with China. COVID-19, and they say there were no COVID-19 cases, but that's questionable. That's beside the point. The fact of the matter is they do need humanitarian assistance. And you mentioned China. My view is I think China now will be providing some of that food aid that they historically have done. And I think South Korea also historically has provided a significant amount of food aid. And I think now with the encouragement of North Korea engaging in inter-Korean dialogue for humanitarian and economic, but certainly humanitarian, I think food aid will be there. I think for the US, whether it's the World Food Program, going through the World Food Program, we've always been a major food donor to North Korea. I think we were there. So I think everyone's there to provide the humanitarian assistance to get the food aid into North Korea, but also the pharmaceuticals and some of the medical assistance that they need, whether it's tuberculosis work and other areas. So I think it's all there. I think now North Korea just has to open itself up, open those borders, open those gates, so that China and South Korea and the United States, working through the World Food Program, can get that aid into North Korea, and the NGOs can start getting into North Korea to do the very necessary work. But a lot of that is with North Korea and how they manage this issue. And I think Kim Jong-un is fessed up to it, saying, we didn't manage it well. And that's why it's so tense right now. But talking about an arduous march, he's reminding the North Korean people of what happened in the late 1990s, where over 1 million people died of starvation. My God, ladies and gentlemen, this is 2021. That can't happen again. So hopefully that aid, that food aid and other aid and humanitarian assistance will start flowing into North Korea. But again, that's part of being part of the international community. That's part of not just pursuing nuclear weapons and missile delivery systems and working on, cyber for nefarious illicit purposes, but becoming a responsible stakeholder. And part of that will be getting into negotiations to make these points and to move in a more positive direction.
Very good. Thank you. Fred?
Well,
How can we respond to this starvation? How should we respond, America?
well, look, the donors are available to contribute the aid. They just want assurances it won't be diverted to the military or sold, which has happened in the past. And I think North Korea has to make a decision to allow accountability, as Ambassador Hill was saying. And so far, we have never seen the North willing to do that. I believe that this is something the U.S. needs to put a lot of time into, because we have to help the North Korean people despite the government, but arranging that is extremely difficult. I think China may be the only power that may have the influence to do it, but we can't underestimate the willingness of this criminal regime to starve and torture and kill its people to stay in power. I don't think that has changed. It's a terrible situation. I hope the Biden administration is putting significant diplomatic resources on solving it. But the problem is in North Korea. It's not an absence of food or organizations willing to provide it.
Our final point, just final remarks from each one, just very brief. What's your advice to the Biden administration, Joe, Chris, and Fred?
Well, no, I think, we have a special envoy, Ambassador Sun Kim, and he's out there. He's talking about, I'll meet you anytime, anywhere. Hopefully China can encourage North Korea to engage with the United States, get something going on that. And we should also look at the opportunity of a multilateral aspect to working this issue here. Even if we do engage bilaterally initially, it may morph into a more multilateral approach where we feel that this would be a more comprehensive way of managing it. And I want to go back again to the six-party talks, because I think we did have a lot of good work between the 5 countries and North Korea working through some of the issues. It didn't succeed in the end, but there was elements there that showed us that this is a possibility. And when you bring all these players together, and I'll mention also the Korea Energy Development Organization that was working with the European Union and Australia and others to get civilian nuclear energy into North Korea. There's so many opportunities here. if we could just open that spigot and look at so many of the other opportunities, but also so many of the players who contribute to a dialogue with North Korea to move in a more positive direction.
Thank you. Ambassador Hill.
I think it's very important we keep this issue on the top tier. As difficult as it is, we need to make it a top tier issue. I think secondly, we need to work very hard to keep our alliances together. I'd like to see improvement in the ROK-Japan relationship. I think that's worth working on. But most of all, to keep working with our allies there to dissuade the North Koreans from any thinking that any behavior on their part can weaken our commitment to our allies. I'd like to see some dialogue with China, maybe to remove some distrust on it, maybe to get some more insights in how they're looking at it. I don't see right now an opportunity to really engage China and go after a change in North Korea behavior, but certainly I think we need to be talking to the Chinese about this critical #1 issue. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, in a country, namely our country, where we cannot even seem to agree on a Mother's Day resolution, we got to come together on some of these foreign policy issues. We got to kind of suck it up and be a little more mature about how we can work together and stop putting everything in this potpourri of domestic political issues. We got to do a much better job of coming together and understand that there are certain national interests that our country has, interests that are shared by left and right. And one of those is getting North Korea off of this nuclear ambition. And we got to do a much better job of coming together on that. I speak as a former negotiator where you're getting as much criticism as you are from home as you were from the North Koreans. You know, I wasn't negotiating with air. I was negotiating with people who seemed to disagree with everything I was trying to do. But we got to do a better job of supporting each other on how we approach tough issues like this.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. Fred?
Well, I would advise the administration to take a tough approach. I would do it bilaterally. I don't see any credible diplomats or senior officials in this administration. I think I would name someone like former Senator Richardson or maybe former CIA Director Jim Woolsey to be a North Korea senior envoy, someone who they respect, and see what can be done in negotiations at a high level. And I also think that the administration has to recognize that China is not a competitor. It is an adversary. We should not have normal relations with China while it is engaged in genocide, while it is stealing our technology. And I think there's a way of approaching China that can be tough without talking about war. There's a reason why 24 Trump officials were sanctioned by China on Biden's inauguration day, because Trump was tough on China. He put tough sanctions on it. He was calling it out for causing the coronavirus to become a worldwide pandemic. And I think we need to be tough with China. We need to work with our allies to be tough with China, and we cannot allow them to dominate the resumption of multilateral talks in North Korea.
I want to thank everyone here, Ambassador Detrani, Ambassador Hill, Mr. Fred Fleitz, for an excellent session. Unfortunately, we've run beyond our time, but it's so important to hear your thoughts and think about how we can do better. I want to thank our audience, the Washington co-sponsorship with the UPF, and we'll have another session at 12 noon that will look at environmental engagement with North Korea. We have an expert on what's happening with the Gobi Desert and deforestation and the kind of dust storm that's putting over both Japan and Korea. And we have other experts on reforestation in North Korea. Thank you very much, and